July 11th, 1944, near St. Lo, Normandy. Dawn came on like a slow bruise, purples giving way to a jaundiced yellow sky that made the hedgerows look older than countries. The earth was damp and tight and smelled of chalk and manure and cordite. A low-ground fog clung to the lanes as if it wanted to keep everything that was about to happen from being seen by anyone who could tell the story later. Along a notch of pasture broken by apple trees and waist-high nettles, a US field artillery battery had worked all night turning a rectangle of Normandy into a geometry problem. The guns sat canted on their trails like animals after a long pull. 4 105s dug in behind berms built from sod and the spoils of a hedgerow torn open by a dozer that had muttered to itself until its engine knocked like a drunk at a locked door. The crews moved with the weary precision of men who knew the steps and had no use for flourish. Boots thudded on boards. A pry bar clanged against a spade. A hand brushed mud off a sight like a priest brushing dust from a reliquary. Someone laughed once, quietly, because you had to pretend you were still a person when the world asked you to be a machine. The section chief, a man with a face that looked poured rather than carved, checked the bubble on the quadrant with the tip of his finger and listened to the far side of the field as if the hedgerows could speak numbers. He had been a machinist in Pennsylvania before the war, gave him a different vocabulary. Deflection, time of flight, safe distance, super quick, delay. His crew, 5 men who had become a single creature with 3 lungs and 6 hands, stood in that morning breath of quiet, waiting for a fire mission that everyone knew would arrive the way rain does when a front has set its mind to it. Their gun was named without consent. Someone had painted a girl's name on the shield because that was what men did when they needed something to care about. That could also kill the name had washed off in a week of Normandy rain, leaving only streaks that looked like a hand had tried to claw its way out of the steel and failed. The forward observers were already awake in the hedges 3 fields over, squinting through binoculars at nothing that would admit it was something German armour had been probing all night. Short snorts of engine, then stillness. A turret nose showing, and then a lull that could be patience or a mechanical devil trying to remember which lever meant what. The infantry clung to the wet sides of ditches, jackets the colour of dirt, eyes swollen from a week's worth of sleep snatched in 3-minute bites. Hedgerow country taught its own ugly mathematics. A field was not a field. It was a room without a roof, bounded by earthworks that drank shells and returned the debt in splinters. A lane was not a lane. It was a rifle barrel pointed at whoever was too honest to distrust a straight line. Tanks hated it. Men bled for it. Artillery had to learn how to write its language in air. The first message snapped across the wire with the same impolite energy as a bee that has found a window pane. Fire mission. Battery adjust grid. Numbers that gave the day shape. Target description. Armour, half-tracks, infantry riding the decks. The forward observer's voice had the flat acceptance of a man reading a weather report that says the tide is coming in whether you want the beach or not. The section chief repeated the numbers because repetition kept the fear away from the hands that needed to be steady. Deflection 3275, quadrant 279, charge 3, fuse time 2.8. He looked at the fuse man, and the fuse man looked back with the blank politeness of someone being accused by an innocent. The time fuse was a small, arrogant thing, brass and numbers, and a promise that chemistry obeyed clocks. It did not care about hedgerows. It cared about arc and seconds and whether a man's thumb had the humility to set the line between life and death exactly where the tool told him to. They wanted airburst. Everybody wanted airburst in hedgerow country because the enemy did not walk in lines like a parade. He crouched in shadows and ran in the ditches and rode a tank's back like a lifeboat. A shell that burst on the ground tore a hole in a place that needed a roof torn off. A shell that burst above a lane rained metal into men and engines and the quiet spaces between planes. The manuals taught time fuse as a gentleman's art, with tables and wind and height of burst calculated like interest. Normandy taught that the world did not care how tidy your math was if the hedge ate the blast and offered it back as a shrug. The fuse man set the ring to 2.8 seconds with the fused concentration of a man counting another man's pulse. He handed the shell forward. The loader slid it into the breech as if pushing a child who refused to go into a bath. The breech slammed and latched. Fire! The gun recoiled like a body trying to leave a bed it hated. The shell went up through air that felt too heavy for flight, arced over a hedgerow that had been older than some nations until last week, and dove into a geometry where seconds mattered more than courage. Out in the hedges, the forward observer watched the lane through a sliver between thorns and counted with his teeth. The burst came 2 hedges beyond the lane, a fist of light crumpling into smoke about 15 feet above mud. He wanted closer to the first hedge. He wanted the rain to start before the men riding the tanks could use the ditch. Add 50, shorten point 2. His voice did not have impatience in it. Impatience was a sin you committed when you thought the world owed you a different version of itself. The crew adjusted the fuse. The loader breathed in the smell of grease and nitrocellulose and pine, as if he could stack those smells like sandbags between him and what came next, and they fired again. The burst came closer, a hiccup of light above the lane's curve. The observer said, "Repeat," and then he said, "Repeat," and then he said a word that made everyone in the battery square their shoulders a little more. Battery. It meant all the guns would speak at once, writing a paragraph in air rather than a sentence. The battery fired, a stuttering chorus as each gun's crew tried to be a machine and failed by the margin that makes men human time fuses popped in a line above hedgerows. The lane filled with smoke that had the colour of a hard decision. The tank slowed because even a machine knows when the sky has turned against it. It should have worked the way Doctrine wanted. It almost did. But Doctrine had written its pages in fields where trees were tall and spaced the way painters wished they were. Here, the hedges were walls with leaves and mud in their blood. The first wave of shells pruned branches and punished the top layer of leaves. You could hear the shrapnel chew the hedge like a goat. Men in the ditches flinched, but did not break. The tanks, short-nosed Panzers with crews that had learned to hate and love their machines as if they were family, took the rein on their decks and kept rolling, men on the back ducking under the line of their shoulders so that a bursting shell might choose a different man to ruin. The second wave came lower, and that was when the first mistake happened, the kind the day had been growing toward all along. The fuse man had been rotating brass for 6 minutes, which in this war and this morning was the same thing as a week. His thumb had lost a little skin to the knurling. His counting had become less like a hymn and more like a litany. The section chief had the next number in his mouth and something else in his head, a memory of a tree burst at Anzio that had turned a field into a snow globe of terrible things, when the fuse man's hand slipped and set the ring a hair shorter than anyone intended. He passed the shell forward. The loader did not notice because you cannot notice everything when the world is asking you to be fast and careful at the same time. The breach closed with the noise of something that had just decided not to open again without a fight. Fire! The shell went out into the same stifling air that had received its brothers and chose a different ending. It burst early, below the top of the hedge, above the lane, at a height that made a kind of savage sense the manual had never had the honesty to write down. The burst was not a round bloom. It was a ragged mouth biting downward. Shrapnel scythed into the hedgerow's earthen wall and ricocheted into the lane like it had discovered that geometry could be vulgar. The sound was not a single sound. It was a paragraph of sounds. The crack of the burst, the wet thudding of fragments into soft things and hard, the metallic objection of a tank's deck. A scream cut off before it could decide to be a scream or a word. The forward observer did not say anything for a half second because you do not interrupt an experiment that has just admitted it is going to change the day. On, he said, and the word carried more weight than 3 letters should be allowed to carry. Shorten point 1. All guns, repeat. The guns repeated. More shells burst below the hedge's crown and above the ditch's lip. The rain was different now, not the flat cone of a polite airburst, but a tearing flood in a band where men's backs were and where a tank's hatch had to open if anyone inside wanted air. An infantry squad tried to run across a gap and vanished under fragments that did not care whether you had been brave yesterday. A half-track kissed the bank to squeeze past a dead truck and exposed its passengers to the rich, newly dangerous air. They went down the way wheat does when the combine finds its rhythm. A tank commander put his head out of a turret to shout something that his crew knew already, and immediately regretted every good thing he had ever said about luck. The section chief had not meant to do it. The fuse man had not meant to do it. Intention did not matter. The hedge's roof had been the wrong target all morning. The ditch's ceiling was the right one. The chief did not praise the accident because praise is as dangerous as panic when men are working on the edge of what their hands can manage. He just said, "Hold that cut." And for the first time all morning, the crew's motions lost the trembling that had made them hard to love. The fuse man set the next ring short on purpose and passed it forward. The loader seated the shell like a man choosing exactly where a nail should go in a wall that has been lying about its studs. The gun spoke. The air obeyed. It took 3 salvos for word to ripple to the other guns. In a hedgerow battery, information moves at the speed of a runner trusted by the first sergeant, and fear moves faster. Both arrived at the other sections with a kind of controversial urgency. "Shorten it," someone said, and the other someone said, "How short?" And then the chief said, "This short. Do what this hedge wants." You could map the new burst height by the new noise in the lane. Not the hollow, muffled whump of a ground burst hugged by dirt. Not the distant pop of a polite tree burst above leaves, but a hard, slicing detonation that made the earth flinch and blow its breath out sideways. Shrapnel scissored along the ditch ceiling, and the backs of men hunched under it. The tank decks became pans catching an angry rain. The hedgerow itself seemed to cough on what it had been hoarding since the last century. The forward observer's voice took on the tone men use when the world, briefly, is willing to be managed. Left 200 same, right 50, same battery, repeat. Somewhere in the fields beyond, a German officer who had believed all week that this country could be disciplined by steel felt the back of his neck tighten the way animals do before thunderstorms. He grabbed a runner and said something that was probably reasonable when it left his mouth and became a prayer before it reached the runner's ears. The runner took 3 steps, and then the sky above the hedge put a nail through his shoulder and told him he would not be running anywhere today. It is easy to be unfair to the enemy in histories written by the side that got to write them. The Germans were trying to do something difficult well. They were trying to bundle up shock in a place that turned shock into a bad joke. Armour wants roads and fields and sight lines. Hedgerows gave it blind corners and ruts, and the feeling that every turn of a track might trespass on a mine someone had forgotten to tell the map about. They brought infantry to fill the spaces the armour could not inhabit. They rode men on decks because it was faster, and because faster was what they needed. The 2 short fuses did not punish stupidity. They punished the one vulnerability the doctrine had not had the time to hide under another layer of leaves. The inches of air where men had to be. The infantry down in the ditches heard the change before they understood it. American riflemen who had learned to stay small and breathe through cloth and count their friends after every lull raised their heads like dogs who have heard a whistle 3 streets over the gun line. Somewhere behind them, somewhere dependable, somewhere that made numbers into violence, had found a new note to play. The fragments did not arrive from the sky's polite top. They arrived from the roof just above their enemies' necks. They watched a machine they had learned to hate with a very personal hate, an MG nest built into the hedge like a tumour, go quiet as if someone had turned off its electricity. They did not know whether it was luck or genius behind them. They did not ask. They moved. That is what infantry does when the sky says now. The German column tried to back up, which is a thing columns in lanes are famously bad at doing. A half-tracks driver threw his gearbox into whatever he hoped was reverse and found a stump that had been carved by a farmer's grandfather and never moved since a Panzers commander slapped the loader's helmet, because that was what you did when the day had gone wrong and you needed someone to know that at least you were still there. The loader slammed around into the gun and the gun spoke and punched a hole in a hedge that did not have the decency to bleed. A shell burst below the hedge's ear line and reached into the tank through the commander's open hatch. It did not go far, but it did enough. The turret went quiet. A man fell halfway out and then found, after a half-second of someone else's grace, that he would not be finishing that exit. At the guns, the work began to find its rhythm, the one that wrong men have called beautiful because they mistake competence under duress for art. It was not beautiful, it was correct, which in war is a better compliment. Fuses came out of tins, got set a hair shorter than doctrine preferred, slid onto shells, shells slid into breeches, breeches slammed, lanyards tugged, recoil cylinders did their chewing. The chief watched the bubble and the men and the horizon, which in that little rectangle meant a hedgerow line where the world was being decided by inches of time. The radio murmured. The wire hummed. The whole battery breathed in the shallow way men do when their bodies have learned that deep breaths invite a god to put a hand on your chest and ask questions about your plans for the afternoon. Somewhere behind them, closer to the roads where jeeps frowned at maps, an artillery liaison officer heard Shorten and Below Crown 3 times in 2 minutes and made a decision that would embarrass the manual and save lives he would never meet. He ran his finger down a paragraph he had memorized in a schoolhouse and decided to treat it like something you might serve with eggs rather than like a commandment. He phoned the battalion fire direction centre and said, "Time fuses below hedge height, hold that cut, guns to repeat." The FDC did what FDCs do when the field tells them the field is right. They added caution to speed in a ratio that would irritate everyone and save exactly as many lives as could be saved. 2 more batteries came onto the net with coordinates that sang in the same key. The lane where the armour had tried to prove that fear respects gold crosses on tank grills became a place where the air did not love men anymore. The enemy learned faster than pride wanted. The column broke into tense pieces and tried to pour into fields that had been vegetable gardens a week ago and killing corridors now. Some made it, most did not. The hedges that had kept the Americans honest now kept the Germans humble. Airbursts shredded the first 20 inches of air above a ditch. Shrapnel knuckled under helmets. Hands that had been well suited to lifting sacks of grain in a brave, doomed economy now let go of rifles because a shard had been persuasive. A tank put its snout into a gap and found a culvert, and then found that its weight was the wrong answer to a question asked by Roman engineers generations ago. It tilted, and a round detonated above its rear deck and turned the machine from a noun into a past tense. After an hour that felt disrespectful of minutes and elastic where seconds were concerned, the column stopped trying to be a column. The tanks lurched into reverse and disgorged their infantry into ditches that no longer promised asylum. The half-track slewed and stalled because drivers' feet have opinions when the air has knives in it. A runner found his officer dead and told a different officer the same sentence because orders are a kind of currency, and when the bank closes, someone still has to pay the bill. The forward observer rolled to a new notch in the hedge, glass to his eye, and said, almost gently, "Shift left 200, same." It sounded like forgiveness. It was not. The battery paused once because the gun line must respect physics, even when the heart wants to disrespect mercy. Tubes were hot. Grease ran a barrel that stays too hot for too long forgets that it was made from men's plans. It becomes a metal that obeys the old laws. The chief ordered water. Men in helmets poured canteens over steel that hissed like insults. He let one crew breathe for 60 seconds because their fuse man was shaking. He had been the accident and he knew it. The chief put a hand on the man's shoulder, a brief pressure that said, "You are the reason we are winning, and you are allowed to hate that." Then the mission came back in like a tide that you can hear but cannot argue with. They fired again. The two short fuses did not care whether the man setting them wanted to be remembered. They cared about the difference between 2.8 and 2.5 seconds and held that difference until chemistry said okay. By noon, the counterattack was a rumour told by men who had not been there to men who were grateful not to be. The infantry went forward in fits and starts, heads low, rifles ready, finding the places the airbursts had already cleared and discovering the stubborn pockets that only a grenade and the fascinating bravery of a 19-year-old could solve. They stepped over a lane turned into a collection of things that had been nouns. A carbine shaped like a question mark, a boot that did not have a man left to be in it, a mess tin holding a soup of rain and leaves and something else. A GI peered into a tank whose hatch had been forced open by heat and decided he would never tell his father that war smelled like pennies and pork cooked wrong. Behind them, the guns fell silent in the embarrassed way hammers do when they have hit something exactly. If the day had ended there, the story would have been clean in the way stories like to be when they are told after dinner. But war keeps its best jokes for after the credits. The battalion commander, a man who had learned to keep his shoulders square because shoulders transmit fear, came up to the battery as the crews were swabbing and asked 3 questions the way a man asks about a recipe he knows he will be judged for serving to strangers. What did you set? Why did you set it? Can you do it again? The chief told the truth, because the truth is easier to remember when dead men might ask you to repeat yourself in dreams. He said that they had been setting the time short, below hedge crown, so that the burst would bite down into the ditch. He said they had done it first by accident and then on purpose. He said yes, with the caution of a mechanic who knows that luck is not a tool, but will let itself be counted as one in the box if you ask politely. Word went sideways and up. Fire direction tried to put numbers around something the hedge had taught in a syllable. The liaison jotted a note to division. Time on target sequences adjusted for hedgerow geometry. Observed effect devastating on infantry clinging to ditches and tank decks. The battalion S3 added a sentence about significant morale effect, which was the bureaucratic word for the way men's hands shake after the air has turned against them. Somewhere in an ordnance shop, a captain with ink on his cuffs and a sore wrist from signing forms wrote a memo that sounded like a prayer trying to put on a lab coat. Recommend interim doctrine. Time fuse settings to achieve burst at approximately 8 to 12 feet AGL in hedgerow terrain. He did not write how the mechanics of cutting that close would punish carelessness. He assumed the men at the guns knew, because they always did. Industry does not care about the romance of such things. It cares whether a setting can be mass-produced. The factories in the States had been turning out fuses at a rate that made auditors frown, and then sit down because their legs had decided to be impressed. The brass rings with their careful knurling and their little numerals like dime store jewellery had been on tables from Newark to Detroit, and women with hair tied up in social vows and cloth had been clicking them through test rigs that clucked and stamped and pushed them into tins. The word went back that the boys needed rings that could hold their nerve a tenth of a second shorter and not sulk with variability. The toolmakers adjusted. The jigs got a hair tighter. Gauges that had winked at a good enough tolerance were made to glare until the needle sat exactly where the new chart said it had to sit. The world does not give much credit to the man who adjusts a die so a notch cuts cleaner. He is the midwife to a better doctrine. In the weeks that followed, the trick stopped being a trick and became a habit. Airbursts in the hedgerows turned from a rumour into a morning ritual. The Germans adapted. They always did. They crawled deeper under the hedges and built little roofs of doors and stolen timber, and the fragments found them anyway because men at the guns cut a tenth shorter, and the fragments remembered how to skip tanks closed their hatches and wished that oxygen were a thing you could buy in cartridges. The enemy learned to time his rushes to the moments when the guns had to change tubes, or the shells had to come up a lane that had become a museum of broken intentions. He got through sometimes. When he didn't, it was because the sky had decided the day would be easier if it greeted men at 8 feet and not 18. There were bad days. There always are when novelty outruns caution. A time fuse set too short is an arm reach away from a fuse set for the shuttered kind of disaster. One crew lost a number and set a shell to burst, before it should have understood that roofs are roofs. The burst took the hedge and a slice of the lane, and the first 3 feet of air, where a sergeant had been counting something that mattered. He did not finish counting. The battery carried him to the aid station with the abrupt kindness artillerymen show one another, because they know what it is to make the world obey, and they know how little that obedience owes them personally. The chief did not change the doctrine because one man died. He wrote 6 sentences about discipline and laminated them with his eyes. By the time St. Lo fell into the basket, Americans had been weaving around it all July. The too short fuse was as much a part of the day as cigarettes and sweat, and a song someone hummed when no one was listening. Its logic even taught something bolder to people who had been keeping a secret. There had been talk for months about a fuse that could sense the ground by feeling the echo of its own radio whisper. A proximity that would burst because the world said it was time, not because a ring had been turned to the place a hand believed time should be. That fuse had stayed mostly off the battlefield because the people who loved it loved secrecy more, and because the fear that one would fall into enemy hands had a weight of its own. Hedgerow country made secrecy feel like arrogance, When those clever shells began to arrive and were tried, the gunners who had taught themselves where 8 feet lives recognised in the proximity burst the official version of the thing the hedge had taught them by cutting a ring too short. The sky did not go from empty to full in a second. It went from clever to inevitable. Then came Mortain. August 7th, the counterstroke east of Avranches, when the German command gathered what it could, Panzer Lehr torn and angry, 2nd SS Das Reich still dangerous even after the long bleed from the bocage, and tried to slam shut a door the Americans had only just learned to walk through. The fog was a collaborator that morning. Tanks moved like rumours on the slopes above the town, engines low, tracks muttering the old language of momentum. The radio nets from infantry to guns were a tangle of fear braided into professionalism. The word that travelled best was simple. Armour. Many. Close. The American line held on by fingernails and habit, and the guns reached out for a familiar lever. Time fuses were cut like a litany, shorter for the lanes where the Panzers crept, shorter above the tree belts where infantry shadowed them. The forward observers at hilltop OPs had a view that felt like a sin, open country after months of green tunnels, and they used it with the fervour of converts. Bursts climbed down the slopes in bands that were neither curtain nor wall but something meaner, a series of ceilings exactly where men wanted to stand. Mortain did not yield to romance. It yielded to a clock in the hands of men who had spent July learning to shave tents like gamblers shave luck tanks, that made it into the town, found streets turned into boxes where the air was already occupied. Infantry that tried to dismount found that their first breath was their worst. The counterattack broke on things that are hard to put on a map. Timing, habit, the way a crew shares a look after an accident, becomes a doctrine, and decides that today is a day worth being alive for. The trick did not win Mortain alone, nothing did. Fighter bombers arrived when the fog relented and made their own arguments. Bazookas held corners, machine guns stitched the seams that shells had ripped. But when the story of that week is told softly by men who lived long enough to be soft, a sentence keeps coming back with the weight of a bell. We lowered the sky on them. It is a strange boast, and it is not a boast. It is a confession that knowledge can be a weapon sharper than a new alloy. Back at the depots, the ripple kept moving. Ordnance officers wrote to fusing plants with a specificity that sounded like love letters to decimals. Maintain timing tolerance tighter at the short end. Ensure rings hold against vibration. Ship more super quick for the fences, but keep time fuse priority high for bocage and towns. Inspections grew teeth. A rejected fuse was not an insult. It was a promise that someone downrange would not have to explain to a chaplain how a tenth of a second had outvoted a prayer. In training areas behind the lines, fresh batteries learned shortcut lessons from sergeants who had dirt under their nails from St. Lo. Weed your hedgerow bursts just below the leaf line. Count aloud. Make the loader repeat the time. Tap the ring with your knuckle and feel if the click is lying. Measure twice in your head because you don't get to measure once out there. German reports learned the new sentence the hard way. Field notes taken from dead officers' map cases admitted that American artillery had found a burst height that took away ditches and decks. The two places a man could feel clever in a country that did not like cleverness diaries, when they could be read between water stains and the buckling where a hand had held on during a barrage. Talk about the air ripping, as if it had suddenly remembered it was made of knives. Panzer commanders who had built their instincts on eastern horizons had to learn a different set of reflexes. Close the hatch even when your lungs beg. Use smoke though you hate not seeing. Stop short of the gap if the guns are talking just above the hedge you need. Some learned. Some learned too late. And always, because war likes balance, there were costs. A section that had cut fuses short for 3 days in a row found itself on a field with taller trees and forgot to forgive the extra height. The bursts bit into leaves and wasted their fury grooming canopies. The observer, a lieutenant whose voice had cracked into old age in a month, swallowed pride and told the battery to lengthen again. They did, with the quiet grace of people who have used a gift and now put it back in the drawer because today's table needs a different tool. Another crew, drunk on success and bad coffee, hurried a set and dropped a fragment band too low. The shell took hedge and dirt and a sliver of their own forward line. The line bent but did not break. The next salvo was set right. The sergeant who wrote the day's report put the mistake in the middle of the page so it could not be hidden by the edges. As the front moved beyond the bocage, the technique moved with it like a song you hum without noticing. In the villages outside Coutances and the crossroads east of Vire, airbursts at second-story height harvested window snipers who had believed stone was a cousin of immortality. In the parks of Le Mans, where trees had been planted to teach men that geometry could be beautiful, bursts beneath the crowns taught that geometry could also be loyal to whoever measured first. And when Operation Cobra's carpet bombing tore a hole in the German line big enough to march a new kind of war through, the batteries that followed kept their rings honest and their tenths shaved for the moments when a column on a road or a file along a hedgerow needed a reminder that air can be partisan. The trick's legacy outlived the hedges. When proximity fuses spread, first cautiously, then with the relief of men finally allowed to use what had been kept under lock, Gunners who had made their hands fluent in tenths found themselves smiling at a device that made the right answer by itself. They trusted it faster because the hedge had trained their eyes to see what a correct burst looks like. VT shells blossomed at just the cruel height. Men downrange felt the old scissoring all over again, only now the ring and the thumb and the skinned knuckle were replaced by a circuit that listened to its own echo and decided it was time. The gunners were not made obsolete by the new cleverness. They had made the battlefield ready for it, and the battlefield rewarded them by letting them keep their jobs and go home a little more often. Years later, when the world had found other ways to scare itself, manuals would write the hedgerow lesson in clean language. In enclosed terrain, optimum burst heights are significantly lower than open country norms. Adjust fuses to produce downward-biased fragmentation patterns that exploit overhead cover limitations. It is accurate, and it is polite, and it is not how a sergeant explains a morning to a private with shaking hands. He says, "Cut it a hair, son. Let the fragments rake their backs, not the leaves." He says it like a secret that both of them wish wasn't true. If you need to see the doctrine's face, look at a battery roster from that July and count the men who made it to September. Count the ones who learned to set their breath to the clock, the in as the lanyard comes taut, the out as the recoil climbs, the hold as the observer says on, or left, or again. Count the ones who stayed, and the ones who didn't, and admit that the ring on a fuse and a thumb on a knurling became, for a span of weeks, the difference between nouns and memories. Then look past the roster and down a lane where the hedges stand like jurors. The lane is quiet now. Apple trees bend under fruit that would have been stolen by hungry men in 44 and is now left to fall and sweeten the ditch. A rusted buckle in the mud has no story left to tell and tells it anyway. If you listen, the air explains itself. I was made to carry rain and voices and the smell of hay. For a while men taught me to carry knives. They taught me where to hold them so their enemies could not breathe. I did as I was told, and then I forgot, because forgetting is how the world forgives itself. The section chief with the poured face went home after the winter and built machines again, and sometimes he would pause over a measurement and feel with his thumb for a click that wasn't there. The fuse man kept his hands busy the rest of his life. Carburetors, clocks, anything with a ring to set, because idle hands remembered tenths too easily. The forward observer learned to sit with his back against hedges in peacetime and not count the spaces between the leaves. When asked by grandsons what he did, he said, "I told them where to put the roof, and let the boy imagine a house instead of a lane." The Germans who survived dragged the word for that rain into other wars. They had felt air that hated them and had to explain to their own sons why ditches no longer comforted them. In letters that never left footlockers, men wrote about how the sky bit in Normandy, how they had once loved fields and now preferred streets because, at least in a city, the corners are honest about being traps. Somewhere a former Panzer commander stood in a field behind a grocery and looked at the distance between the grass and his eyes and decided to go back inside. By the time museums mounted 105s on parquet floors and put fuses in glass cases where toddlers could smear ore on them with their fingers, the story had become a paragraph that school groups could digest between the landing craft and the jeep. It is no one's fault that it shrank. Stories have to fit inside days. But for the men who remember, the paragraph will always be 8,000 words long because every 10th shaved burst had names attached to it, some spoken in the OP, some never learned but still felt through the wire. The innovation was not a thunderclap. It was a thumbslip, an apology, a decision, a habit, a doctrine, a memory. Toward evening on that first St. Lo day, the battery received a final mission, almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Harass and interdict at dusk, lanes and hedges west of the morning's fight, time fire as before. The chief looked at the fuse man and did not need to say anything because there are days when men do not need language to agree. The ring turned. The loader slid. The breech closed. The gun spoke. Out beyond the view, a hedgerow remembered it was a wall, and then remembered it was a roof, and then learned one more time that ceilings sometimes drop when men ask them to. The bursts stitched a low line across the evening air, and for a minute the day looked like it might be willing to give back a little of what it had taken. Night came on clean and black. The guns cooled and sweated and were wiped and loved. The men lay down in holes they called by women's names and counted in their heads without meaning to. 2.8, 2.6, 2.5. Somewhere a chaplain thanked a god for teaching men how to measure. Somewhere a letter began with, "I am well," and then ran out of adjectives, because the writer had used them all on hedgerows, and somewhere in the quiet that only a battlefield knows, thick, disreputable, earned, the air settled back into being just air, waiting for morning to hand it the knives again.